Considering the human story in the New World, we archaeologists believe that humans came across the land bridge in the high north some 15 to 20 millennia ago. Those original entrants then filtered through the continent stretching from the high Arctic to the tip of South America. Over time, these peoples who began the trek as hunters and gatherers and foraging people who were really following the large game herds of animals moving across the vastness of the Beringian plain that existed due to the lowered sea levels during the Ice Age, really were not seeking a particular direction. They were just drifting behind the game herds of the animals and so on, ultimately bringing them into what we consider today the New World. These migrations were numerous, and so it was something that represented movements of peoples back and forth over this vastness of numbers of thousands of years of time. As hunting-gathering people, the people were very nomadic, displacing themselves following the game herds that they were hunting and collecting wild plants in the process, and following the water routes largely, because the water attracted plants, attracted animals, which attracted humans. We then come to a point where certain plants attracted the interests of the prehistoric peoples, especially in the very southern clines of the Central Valley of Mexico. In those Central Valley areas, certain wild grasses and other wild plants began to attract people to the extent that they focused more of their time on gathering those plants, clearing areas around those plants and so on, so that ultimately those plants began to respond in undergoing various genetic changes just caused by their environments being altered by human activity. The human activity then ultimately results in the emergence of a series of plants that are of particular interest to the peoples, including a very ancient form of maize, several varieties of beans, squash, a number of other plants that come into sort of a triad of really important plants in the New World. These plants ultimately then caused certain groups to become more settled on the landscape. So what we're really talking about is sort of the beginnings of what we think of as horticulture and or emerging into agriculture. The plant communities then in the Central Valley of Mexico began to cause settled human communities to arise, probably somewhere in the 9,000 to 10,000 years ago. Gradually then, over the next several millennia, peoples move throughout, going south into South America, Central America, and some groups move to the north, carrying with them these seeds that are the beginnings of really the garden products that people are growing. When these movements extend up through and into what is now North America, some groups go off into what is today the desert Southwest to establish some of the cultures that we refer to as the Anasazi or the Pueblo cultures. Other groups, bringing the same seed stocks with them, go over into the Gulf and begin a long trek of movement up the Mississippi River, creating villages that are more and more sophisticated, with garden crops becoming a greater focus of the people. Ultimately, you have a city like the site of Cahokia near present-day St. Louis, which probably boasted a population maybe of 40 or 50,000 people at the height of its occupation. And there you had gardens across the vastness of the American Bottoms region along the Mississippi. Again, as this huge population centers develop along the Mississippi River, You have satellite communities, sort of like suburbs, emerging, and ultimately you have people moving in several different directions. Some groups began to move gradually, sort of following the river drainages to the west. These people established communities coming across the landscape through the woodland area, moving again from river drainage to river drainage, sort of a leapfrogging effect of creating new villages. What happens is the people would exploit resources in the area in which their village was created. And you might think of this something like throwing a pebble in a creek and watching the concentric rings go out from that center point. That is the way in which people utilize the resources. As they diminished their resources, and of course these weren't single villages, there were villages up and down the drainage systems. So ultimately, the people, when they sort of exploited the resources to a point where it was becoming too difficult to go out too far, they bumped into other villages that were doing the same thing. Gradually, areas become abandoned. This isn't due to warfare or anything, it's just due to the fact that certain resources on the landscape were being utilized. Ultimately, it was easier to move, to relocate. The people relocated to the next river drainage, which then brings us into the story about the Mitchell Prehistoric Indian Village where we are visiting today. The site is one that was a village established by peoples who had moved from the river drainages along the eastern edge of the South Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa area, the Big Sioux River. The next drainage system that gets settled is the James River system. This village, the Mitchell Prehistoric Indian Village, is on a small side creek which empties into the James River, Firesteel Creek. And in this case, the people established a village which was a farming village. Along with farming, the people collected wild crops, they collected and hunted animals. An entire range of animals are hunted. The bison probably predominates in its importance out here, but deer, elk, and many smaller creatures were hunted. Also, the people kept as a domesticate and as a beast of burden dogs. So these villages boasted a population of humans as well as a population of dogs, which were the traction animal up to the much later reintroduction of the horse into the New World. They characterized the situation here. The Mitchell site sat on a little finger bluff above the valley of Firesteel Creek. The gardens that the people created were down in the bottom of Firesteel Creek, along the creek itself. It was a gentle descent into the creek bottom. It was probably 80 to 100 feet that the people just walked down off the bluff edge. This village has produced evidence of at least up to 80 of the earth lodge structures that were the dwelling places of the people. Now again, we should understand that these were not all simultaneously built. There were some that were deteriorating, new lodges were being built, but during the occupation period of the village, which we think is probably maybe a human generation or two, maybe up to 100 years. That's something that we are still working on because it's very difficult with radiocarbon dating to get a great precision as to exactly how many years, you know, the village was occupied. But the point is that during the period of its occupation, some lodges were being built, others were deteriorating. A few we have evidence of archaeologically that actually burned. And so you then have a lodge that is a 20 by 40 foot structure, and it's one that would have housed maybe 10 to 12 or 15 people. So in trying to calculate the number of lodges that were simultaneously occupied and the number of people in them, we have come up with the calculation that the village probably boasted at any given time 200 to 300 individuals along with the dogs that they had. They were again hunting, gathering, but their main stock was farming. They grew maize or corn, they grew several varieties of beans, they grew several varieties of squash, they grew a native form of tobacco, they grew amaranth. There were a series of other plants that we have found the evidence in the pollen that would probably have been in the gardens, both as edibles for greens as well as some medicinal plants. So the people also fished, they took wildfowl, they brought clams in, and they hunted small creatures as well. So you've got a very diverse diet and a very solid diet. And so the people were not here in a struggling type of situation. The earth lodges that they constructed were ideally suited for the weather conditions here. The walls probably were 2 feet thick. They had sod-covered roofs. But in this lodge, as you look around, you begin to understand how much timber would have been being used to construct one of these. And so what finally causes this village and other villages along the James River to come to be abandoned, again, is not a story about warfare. It's not a story about disease. This is pre-contact times. It's a story about a resource base which was critical, timber, being timbered out. Because again, this isn't the only village that existed on the James River. There are villages that stretched up and down the James River throughout the extent of its trench here in South Dakota. So each village was using large quantities of timber for construction, for fires, to build, cooking fires, the fires that they built for firing their clay pottery and so on. Ultimately, the next move was from the James River Valley to the Missouri River. So it's a story of displacement of peoples across landscapes. These were empty landscapes when they were being, gradually occupied by these waves of people. And ultimately, these farming villages were one of the major success stories in human adaptations to very challenging environments, hot summers, very cold winters, periods of drought. But again, the human communities that were established showed the signs of being very vital, alive communities facing the same trials and tribulations that we face in our communities today. The particular element that we have been able to introduce at the Mitchell site, which has given us opportunities that we do not usually have in American archaeology. These sites, especially in the northern tier of the country, are difficult at best to work. We usually have a very brief summer season followed by our fall and winter months that would preclude our being able to do any kind of a major excavation. But by creating the Archaeodome facility, it's allowed us a really rare opportunity in American archaeology to be able to do major block excavation of a very complex village site. There are several things about the way in which we selected the position out here on the site to place this building. For many years, whenever these types of village sites were excavated by archaeologists, the tendency was to focus on the earth lodge features, dig those, open up the floor of the earth lodge, because the early work in archaeology here in the Northern Plains was trying to get the details of the architecture figured out. One of the things that was rarely, if ever, investigated were the areas that were the living areas outside between the lodges. So when this building was placed, we calculated it so that we would have the edges of lodges in the several corners of the building, but this zone is a zone that would have been the open outdoor area that the people would have carried on all of their day-to-day living activities in. And whenever this building was placed, it's supported on a series of concrete columns that go down about 40 feet. But before the building was constructed, the column areas where they were going to be placed, we excavated those areas to make sure that we could get the correct depth of the cultural deposits. The cultural deposits at this part of the village go down about 4 meters or about 12 feet. And during the excavation of the columns alone, we took out more than 1.5 million artifacts. So, for instance, this zone right here is an area that shows us a portion of what was a roasting pit prehistorically. The people actually did a clay liner They added hot rocks, and then they added various packages of meat as well as plant material, put more hot rocks on top, and made a baking oven. So what we've seen here is actually this zone of the site out here was being used fairly continuously, so there are a whole series of ovens that are superimposed one on another. These cache pits that we've begun the investigation of were actually being dug to allow the people to store their foodstuffs as well as some of their tools. And it's from these cache pits, which are sort of an encapsulated area. In other words, it has a clear set of controlled sides to it, usually clay lined. We've been able to, in studying microscopically the sediments that come out of these cache pits, document up to about 33 different species of plant material that was being grown in the gardens or was present here on the site. So we begin to get this clear indication that not only were the people growing food crops, but they were also growing some plants that served as medicinal plants, you know, as part of their total repertoire of eating and medical plant material. The zone here we're excavating as a open area in a block excavation, which gives you a much, much clearer picture instead of just excavating random excavation units in sort of a checkerboard effect. Ultimately, the intent will be to open this entire floor up and show, you know, the living areas. We've got areas that we've already documented where some of the foodstuffs were being processed, some butchering was going on. Other areas like this roasting oven. Other areas where they were extracting bone grease to mix with dried meat to produce a product that would be known today as pemmican. So again, these people were showing a very vital set of strategies. Their adaptations to the environment were excellent, and that's something that we frequently forget about the past. We sometimes, in a rather derogatory way, feel like the peoples of the past really didn't have lifeways that were nearly as good as our lifeways. What you really need to think about as we understand the human past is that each group is adapted extraordinarily well to its period in time. The other thing that one needs to think about, and as a carry-away thought, is that peoples, as we make decisions, as all of us make decisions every day of our lives, those decisions are always predicated on the past. So each and every decision we make in the present has an underpinning of this incredible volume of information that comes to the human condition from the past. That is really, to anthropologists, archaeologists, it's the reason that the past is so critically important, because we understand that people had their better days, they had difficult days, they were extraordinarily bright. They created toolkits that allowed them to fabricate extraordinary dwellings out here in the northern plains 1,000 years ago. So again, we really are looking at how these groups fit into their ecotones, worked with their ecotones. They had setbacks, there were periods of drought, there would have been periods where animals migrated further away from the areas, but all of these things were constantly being compensated for through the structure of the ideology of the people and the way in which they were focused on developing different tools and techniques for the changing circumstances that they faced. The carry-away message might be multiple, that by having the ability to investigate sites of this type, we can demonstrate several things, not only about peoples of the past and the ways in which they use their environment, but we also, the intrigue of archaeology itself is really trying to take the bits and pieces, the leavings of these past cultures, and gradually accumulating knowledge that begins to fit together. It's a terrific jigsaw puzzle. it's one where many of the pieces are missing when you start, so we're having to fill in a lot of gaps, but at the same time, at moments in time, we get little vignettes where you can clearly see that some specific event took place, and it's that type of excitement that I think drives all of us that are in the field to have a keen interest in the field, and I think it also informs us in ways that are really quite necessary in today's world to understand the encroachments that the people of the past made on their environments frequently were damaging to those environments, but not quite as catastrophic as some of the encroachments that we today make on our environments. So it's again a set of lessons that are very crucial to today's lifeways, and it's also something that is very intriguing to try to ferret out how these people lived in the past. I'm Dr. Adrien Hannus from the Archaeology Laboratory at Augustana College in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Thank you very much for your attention.